Hello and welcome back to Searching for Reality. And this week we're going to set our sights on utilitarianism and existentialism/romanticism. Lots of isms to look at for this week. So we're going to start with the utilitarians. We talked a little bit about them last week when we were discussing Immanuel Kant and his deontological view of morality and ethics. The opposite of Kant is the utilitarian position. And a couple of individuals are particularly well known in terms of positing the notion of utility and the notion of utilitarianism. And what that is basically is the notion that we allegedly, and we're hardwired likely to do this, we like to seek out pleasure. And pleasure, of course, in the widest sense of the word. It isn't physical pleasure or sexual pleasure or stuffing ourselves full of food. It's being happy, achieving some degree of happiness. And by the same token, we try to avoid pain, again, in the widest possible sense. Pain, which is possibly depression and anxiety and stress. So we like to live pleasurable, happy lives and avoid pain. So it ain't rocket science, is it? It's pretty straightforward. So ethics in this case is the maximizing of pleasure and the minimizing of pain. So again, this is pretty straightforward and really the opposite of Kant. Because if we think about what Kant had said to us, he says, okay, we need to follow an ethics of duty. And what that means is we do something because it is the right thing, right? It's the right thing to do. So Kant proposes an ethics of duty. One, we must do what is right. So when we talk about what is the good thing, we do the right thing. And the right thing is not to lie, not to harm others, not to use people as a means to an end, not to murder someone just because it's convenient, these kinds of things. So when we do something right, it's because we are following an ethical duty that we've placed upon ourselves, of course, which comes from the legal system that we now embrace and live under, because we've also entered into a social contract. But we're doing the right thing because not only do we wish to do it, but we hope that others do it as well, in exactly the same way and under the same conditions. Therefore, what we do that is right is also something that is done universally. In other words, it's done by everyone. So that's the kind of the Kantian position, deontology, or the categorical imperative. The other one is the one that's presented by Jeremy Bentham and his grandson, I should say, J.S. Mills, John Stuart Mill. Now, both Bentham and Mill were consequentialists. Now, what is that? That is a person that thinks not about the action so much as the consequence of that action. And that is essentially the difference between a categorical imperative person, a Kantian or deontological person, because they're always doing the right thing each time. It has less to do with the consequences than it has to do with the right action each time. A utilitarian, because they're more concerned with utility, right? Is this useful? Is this a good thing for society? But that good thing could be a whole range of things. Maybe sometimes lying is a good thing. Maybe harming others is a good thing. Killing in self-defense, for example. Fighting on behalf of one's nation. That is a kind of utilitarian perspective. And so if you were let's say a conscientious objector, someone that does not wish to join the army and kill, you would actually be taking a deontological position because you wish to maintain that strict right choice. I will not kill no matter what. And so those two positions, as you can imagine, offer really two very different ways of viewing our relationship to society, and more importantly, our relationship to each other. And so we're talking here about whether something that we do that is good versus something that is right. And if you are a Kantian, you're doing something because it is right. It follows a duty. If you are a utilitarian, you're doing something that is good because it solves the dilemma, that initial dilemma. And the solving that dilemma creates an increase in happiness. So remember, too, that when we talk about an increase in happiness, it's more so society at large than it is individuals. Because sometimes we as individuals are kind of overlooked as people with feelings and rights and things like that. And we think of society at large. Think of, for example, of wearing a mask and socially distancing right now. Most of us are not exactly excited to be wearing a mask unless you've got some Superman fetish or Batman or whatever. But if you don't, wearing a mask can be somewhat inconvenient. But we do it for the good of society. We do it to minimize the amount of infection rates. That's a social thing. That's not necessarily an individual thing. So we do certain actions, maybe not because we enjoy it, but because we think it's the right thing to do. So if you are a utilitarian, you'll say, look, it's good for me to do this because it helps in the long run. And that's really what utilitarians are always considering. What actions can I perform that will increase the amount of happiness and the amount of good in a society? So John Stuart Mill, in many of the writings, let's say half a dozen books on utilitarianism, he does define the notion of pleasure and happiness. As I mentioned at the beginning, pleasure and happiness are not these sort of very strict physical things, but in fact much larger. They have to do with aesthetic pleasure, going to the museum or enjoying a fine piece of music. Those things are quite different than simply stuffing ourselves full of food. And so Mill writes, quote, "The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong if they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, unhappiness, or displeasure, or in fact pain. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure." So really the long and the short of utilitarianism is really there, right? An action is right in proportion to promoting happiness and minimizing pain. So fairly clear in their objectives. The difference is that Bentham and Mill believe that there are a variety of different means to achieve the same end. And the end, of course, is always an increase in happiness. Bentham as well. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. They alone point out what we ought to do and determine what we shall do. The standard of right and wrong and the chain of causes and effects are both fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, all we say, and all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection to pain and pleasure will only serve to demonstrate and confirm it. So once again, Bentham looks at us in terms of our psychological or physical makeup, and we just simply have a tendency, a preponderance, we'll say, towards pleasure and an avoidance of pain. And Bentham believes that these are the two sort of masters that at times may overtake our lives, but of course we wish to keep them in control and try to increase always the amount of pleasure and minimize the amount of pain. So all of this has to do with this particular view of means and ends, right? Or costs and benefits. These are all the almost kind of mathematical equations that we use to try to explain how we behave towards each other. But really what it amounts to is what's called consequentialism, right? The notion of consequences. And that is the moral view that outcomes or consequences actually matter for moral evaluation. An action is morally good or morally right, depending on which side of the fence you're on. In this case, let's go for morally good, because we're talking about utilitarians. It's morally good because its consequences are beneficial to society. So utilitarianism is itself a kind of consequentialist theory, right? It says that there are the kinds of outcomes that we should pursue are the ones that maximize utility. And utility is simply what will help society. Believing in ghosts and being superstitious and being prejudiced and racist and biased clearly does not help society, because it will help instead to marginalize certain people and demonize certain people. So instead, we look at utility as an action that benefits the most number of people. So it should be impartial, it should be objective, but it should always be useful in the sense that it will affect positively as many people as possible. Now, one thing with utilitarianism is this alleged idea that it is impartial and neutral. But remember, as I mentioned a few moments ago, Utilitarians tend to look at social individuals less so than they look at society at large. So yes, it can be impartial and neutral, but in a kind of paradoxical way. Utilitarians are less concerned with people than they are with society, as I've just mentioned. But what that means is our individual differences, our belief system, our gender, our class position, these kinds of things really don't matter to a utilitarian, because what they're always trying to do is maximize the amount of good in society. It really doesn't matter who you are. So therein lies the impartiality. Now that can work to the detriment of certain people. Let's say you have a very strongly held religious belief that morals need to be taught at home, sexual matters should be discussed, with parents and kids. And along comes Quebec and Ontario a few years ago in introducing, sex education for little kids in primary school. Well, as you can imagine, if you have really strongly held beliefs about the morality behind such an idea, or in this case, the immorality of it, then you would be shocked, and rightly so. And this is exactly what happened in Quebec and Ontario, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, when the sex ed curriculum was introduced in public schools. The people that most responded negatively to it were those that felt they had never been considered or spoken to or asked, hey, what do you feel about this? They were ignored. Why? Because the public policy was being impartial. It was simply saying, okay, the good of this education will be to benefit children, so they can identify body parts. They can identify when somebody may be mistreating them, learning about sexting and learning about consent and important things that matter later on. But they're utilitarians, as policy planners, are doing this and going, we will be impartial. It doesn't matter who these people are. We're going to look at society at large. So when we talk about impartiality and neutrality, it's not in the kind of positive sense that we say, I'm going to be objective and impartial. I will listen to both sides honestly. No. Impartiality here is an ignorance, not in a rude way, but just in not looking at individuals who live in society and looking at anyone who belongs to a certain community as being essentially the same. So that's how this impartiality part works. So classical utilitarians, Bentham and Stewart, for example, yes, they identified the good with pleasure and happiness, and they also believed, right, they strongly believed that we should maximize the good as much as possible. And the way in which we were going to do this is by taking this impartial and neutral stance. So utilitarianism distinguished impartiality and agent neutrality, and the idea was to promote the overall goodness for the same reasons that it would apply to one person than it would to another. But in the example I've just raised, yes, the policy planners were impartial, but almost in a negative way, right? They weren't considering individual people because they just don't. It's just not in the purview to consider every individual. Typically, impartiality is weighing both sides, the good and the bad. It doesn't happen here. We're simply all painted with the same brush. So if that's the case, it does make listening to individual voices rather difficult. Now, I've just spoken about policy planners, of which we have many, both at the municipal level, the provincial, the federal level. So if these people work and they're viewing society in a certain way, they are looking at it in terms of utility. And so utility as a universal principle in terms of policy planning, in terms of social formations, we have here this tool, we can call it, where we can maximize utility, maximize happiness and pleasure for the greatest number of people. And so when we look at it as a kind of foundational sort of position in terms of constructing a good society, we're still doing the same thing. We're still trying to seek out pleasurable experiences. And in this case, with the example I've just given you, even an increase in knowledge, right? An increase in education is considered pleasurable because that would be a kind of aesthetic pleasure. Having greater knowledge about something that you didn't before is considered by utilitarians as a good thing. And rightly so. It is important But again, depending on what the knowledge is, it may rub people up the wrong way, as the expression goes. So yes, we still wish to seek out pleasurable experiences that will generate happiness and goodness and avoid pain. And so if that's the case, can we build a society along the same way? And policy planners believe that yes, we can. We can create a society that will function really along the same rules. And the kind of society that we're talking about is what's been called classical liberalism. And this is the ideas that were presented by John Locke, presented, well, to a certain degree by Thomas Hobbes, but certainly Locke is the primary person simply because Locke presents to us the notion of a democratically elected government. And remember, he's describing this to us in the late 1600s, 1698 roughly, and democracy essentially doesn't even exist anywhere. This is all simply something he's thought through, but he's thought through it in terms of utility. What would be the best form of government? What would be the most effective form of government where people do have a say and can change things? And when they do change things, it's always for the better, right? It's hopefully never for the worst. So if you can certainly associate John Locke with a utilitarian perspective in the sense that he was trying to create a society that would be beneficial to as many people as possible. And so utilitarians then took Locke's model of democracy and liberalism, and they said, hey, why not, right? We can arrange a society that makes it possible for people to be happy, to avoid suffering. Now, at the time these ideas are being presented, for Locke, definitely, but even for Bentham and Mill, Bentham writing in the 1750s to 1770s, this is just before the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the instituting of democratic governments, democratic republics, right? A rule of law. And the rule of law, right? The rules that inform that society were the ones of classical liberalism, and the underpinning, right? The foundation of this classical liberalism was utilitarianism, this notion of increasing the amount of happiness. And of course, in this case, if you think of Locke, right, using natural law, such as the pursuit of life, liberty, happiness, right, it's right in there. And that's one of the natural laws that Locke believed that we had, laws that were devised from reason, right, to be happy. Sounds like common sense. And Locke's going, yeah, could we have that in writing? Can we make a law out of that? Making sure that people are not, unharshly punished or unharshly treated because of certain things. Hey, because of, the color of their skin, the God they believe in, the sex they were born into, all these things matter. And underpinning all of these ideas, right, these policies that create this world of classical liberalism is still utilitarianism. Mill as well, writing in the 1860s roughly, also was using utilitarianism in very much the same way to, in his case, defend individual freedom. So you've got Locke and Bentham talking about society at large and creating an ideal liberal society, an open society. And Mill says, okay, once we have that established in law, let's now work our way down and make sure that individuals are also happy and also are free. Because it'd be difficult to be happy and unfree. I don't think it's possible, right? One goes hand in hand with the other. So if that's the case, then utilitarianism, in the shift from, let's say, a monarchy, which would be Hobbes, and the kind of world that Locke was living in, although envisioning a different one, in that transition, utilitarianism was actually used as a kind of social reform. So at the time it came out, it was considered pretty radical. Now we take it for granted, these particular ideas, but in that transition from a monarchy to a democracy, things like advocating for animal rights, the legal rights and equality of women, enforcing laws against capital punishment, laws in favor of democracy, in favor of voting, prison reform. All of these things were part of ideas that were presented partly by Locke. I mean, the idea of democracy was presented by Locke, but other ideas about the equality for women is be Mill. Jeremy Bentham talked about animal rights, prison reform. There was a tremendously positive and enlightened view of society and those individuals living in said society to make their life as pleasurable and happy as possible. And so we look at it now and say, well, hasn't life always been like this? No, it hasn't. And it's taken a long time. And don't ever forget, those changes, those reforms always come from the bottom up. They are never handed down to us from the top. Not ever, ever. So those social reforms had to be fought for. So utilitarians needed to know how to argue persuasively to say, yes, we should treat animals with more kindness and with some degree of rights. Of course, we should give women equality in terms of their ability to vote and social roles. Prison reform, capital punishment, and on it went. And so these ideas, in turn, if society can allow individuals to be happy, the upside is that society itself will be happy, or at least happier. Mill, writing On Liberty, argued that a person should be allowed to act according to his own inclination and judgments in things which concern himself, to carry his opinions into practice at his own cost. So this is almost not even a democratic, but almost a libertarian point of view. A minimal amount of government interference, a maximum of individual freedom, but still, as he also writes in the same book, that my freedom ends, when I stick out my arm with my fist at the end of it. If I hit someone, my freedoms end because I've now hit someone. So we can do a whole range of different things, and we can dress the way we like and think of the things we like. But Mill says, yes, we will do this because we are enlightened individuals. We understand that what we do is going to benefit society at large. But there are also limits. So we need to know the degree to which our freedom extends, and more importantly, where it stops. And it stops when we start to impact others with our behavior. So thinking this way, in terms of social reform and kind of radical positions, they were radical because of the fact that prior to this, in France, for example, where we also have the radical French Enlightenment, they were fighting against a church who actually didn't mind that superstition and prejudice was actually in society, because if people are that gullible, they can be scared into behaving, right? And this was one of the reasons that utility was introduced as, look, this is no way to run a society. People are scared, superstitious, and guess what? Uneducated. So they go hand in hand. The degree of superstition seems to reflect the lack of education or lack of intelligence in people. The same sort of thing in England, right? More education creates better people, more enlightened individuals who now can take personal responsibility for what they do. So we've got philosophical radicals, and here there's a link. You can take a look at it right there. And also the politics of the early 19th century, because the world we have today really began. It comes into being following the French Revolution, because that is the democracy that we see today, that we have today. But politics and social change, and also economic change in the early 19th century, really have a tremendous impact on the world that we have today, because these changes, these reforms, and these radical reforms at times do start at that time, and we still feel the effects of them, both good and bad. So again, these radical utilitarians, which doesn't even seem like a word anymore, but they were, because of what they believed in, right? Equality for women, and against capital punishment, democracy. They also agitated for reform of parliament, freedom of the press, economic relief programs, abolition of privileges, get rid of corruption, universal suffrage. These are all things that we now take for granted. Universal suffrage is simply the ability to vote. And of course, men could vote for a long time and women could not. And depending on where you were living, in Canada, I believe it was 1918, in the US, 1921 or 24. But in France, for example, again, in an enlightened country with a rule of law, 1948. So 1948, that's not that long ago. So all of these ideas are presented to individuals as better versions of society. And those better versions increase happiness, increase overall pleasure. And people are just generally happier. So really, there was no institution that was not looked at carefully in order to say, look, is this institution functioning to the best of its abilities? And the best of its abilities is to present to others some degree of happiness, some degree of pleasure, so that living there is actually a good thing. So whether it's parliamentary, municipal, scholastic, ecclesiastic, economic, all of these different sections, these different facets of society were looked at and questioned. And the end result was that we ended up with a better society. So we've talked about society and in particular, political structures, economics too was also put under the microscope of utilitarianism. And so we've got here also economic reform. We had political and social reform before. Now we have economic reform, a freeing up of trade, like free trade in particular. In other words, no tariffs between countries, so that the capitalist machine, or the capitalist enterprise, can now look to other areas, other parts of the world for potential markets. That's, of course, now turned completely on its head, which means that where we were looking for free markets, we're now looking for labor pools. So we've lost many of the jobs that have been in first world countries and now being shipped out to developing nations. So economic freedom at first was a good thing. Adam Smith, who is this gentleman here, David Ricardo, this gentleman over here, both of these individuals, although not dyed-in-the-wool utilitarians, had very similar ideas in terms of maximizing happiness through economic exchange and economic reforms such as the ones that I've just described. So they said, look, an open marketplace is what we believe to be the best way. Sure, and that's this point 200 years later, the open market has its problems, because if you don't have at least rules and regulations, then we will have rampant aggressive behavior on behalf of companies that just grow in power and status, and of course gobble up all the smaller ones. So there have to be rules there at some point. We can't at this point expect that individuals or companies will behave themselves, because once you're on the road to more and more profits, guess what? You start rationalizing the ability to do this, and you're not being such a utilitarian anymore. You're just more concerned with maximizing profits, and that can actually be very detrimental to individuals. So, and in the beginning, there was at least a utilitarian perspective in terms of economic reforms. So, we've talked about utilitarianism, a little bit about Kant and deontology, doing something that is right versus something that is good, and we can act in a way that we will think that it will bring something that is better for all of us. And this is what is important. We need to be able to do this and act as if we are going to promote the greatest amount of good. This is what we need to do. So there is a problem with doing it that way, because sometimes you end up with something called ruled utilitarianism, which is something we need to consider. So what do we mean by ruled utilitarianism? I mentioned at the beginning the idea that if an action is good, sometimes it may include lying, or may include something extreme like murder. What do we do, right? What do we do? Which is the right way to go? And so the notion that Bentham introduced to utilitarianism, which is that there are options, right? There is some wiggle room as to which action is more beneficial, right? Because we're thinking of consequences. That can sometimes lead to a problem, right? So let's say, is it acceptable, as it says here, to execute an innocent man to prevent a riot, or to harvest the organs of a single person, or even a dozen people, because it's beneficial? What about the people that are having their organs harvested? What about them? What about the innocent person who's been put to death? So it is a serious problem, because if we don't have a guide by which to at least decide what to do, or some kind of rule, then that wiggle room gets awfully wide. So John Stuart Mill looked at this problem, and he introduced this idea of rule utilitarianism. And he says, look, a rule, right, is something that's morally justified if it still continues to promote the greatest good overall, even though in certain cases, let's call them exceptions, but certain individual cases, it may diminish utility. Specifically, the person who's been put to death, wrongfully or innocently, or the person who's had to donate the organs against their will, or any kind of thing that under different circumstances would not be considered a good thing. So it is a serious problem because utilitarianism gives itself that opportunity. So let's take a look at it and see sort of exactly what we mean here, because there are two types. Okay, so the first is the act utilitarians, which is the action. An action is right if and only if it produces the greatest balance of pleasure between pleasure over pain. The second one is the one that Mill provides for us, which is rule utilitarianism. An action is right if and only if it conforms to a set of rules, some kind of guideline, right? That is the generally accepted and which would produce the greatest balance of pleasure over pain for the greatest number, regardless. So we can make an exception and say, well, in order to quell this riot, we may accuse an innocent person of the crime that has caused the rioting in the first place, just so we can stop people from harming one another. So we harm one person and save a lot of other people. So we have these two different ways of looking at actions. We can simply look at the action purely in and of itself, and that would be act utilitarianism. And we look at an act saying, okay, well, there's more pleasure than there is pain. It's not a bad thing. Versus rule, where you say, okay, hold on. Do we have to charge someone and incarcerate someone innocently? Is there some other way we can do this? And if it seems to be the only option, then you can say, okay, guided by my rules, because I've asked myself, is there some other way to do this? And there isn't, then I will lie, or I will use a person as a means to an end, because it will still achieve a greater sense of good. So whatever you feel about utilitarianism, because there are some people that are really critical of it just for these reasons, understand that there are two different ways to approach it. You can look at it purely in terms of an act, so an act point of view, or from a rule point of view. And with a rule point of view, you at least have some degree of wiggle room still, but you ask yourself, is this really the only way to do it? Is there some other means by which we can achieve the same end? So we can press the objection that the morality of organ harvesting, of useless torture, executing innocent people, does not and cannot rest on whether it happens to promote happiness if it's practiced as a rule. Like, what if the rule was, hey, anything goes, torture more people? The fact that we have had, and probably still do in the U.S., state-sponsored torture against terror suspects. We don't have it against anybody else, but somehow we set aside terror suspects as especially horrible people. So we'll let the rules, bend a little bit, right? Key word here, rules. We'll bend the rules a little bit, and we'll call it, enhanced interrogation. It's just called pure blood revenge, right? And if we kill a few in the meantime, it's par for the course. So we need to be very, very careful when we look at what those rules are and see and ask ourselves exactly what are we allowing? Are we allowing for the torture of innocent people, or the executing of innocent people, or the use of others as a means to an end? We need to be very careful, because if it's only happiness that's being promoted, all of a sudden it looks like there's an awful lot of different things that we can do to achieve that. We need to be very careful as to what it is, that which we consider to be the good action. So that's the first criticism. The second criticism is this notion of pleasure being sort of physical pleasure, sexual pleasure, gastronomical pleasure, stuffing yourself full of food. And is that really any kind of a basis for a morality? And Mill says, okay, hold on here. Hold on. Let's redefine what we mean by pleasure. And he says, look, human beings have faculties that are more elevated than animal appetites, right? We're simply higher beings. And when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness, which does not include the elevated faculties of their gratification. So Mill's view of pleasure is an infinitely wider one than simply bodily pleasures, right? Sexual pleasures, physical pleasures. It isn't just that. It's something that is much higher, aesthetic, cultural, friendship, friendship and happiness go hand in hand. Friendship and enjoying a work of art, whatever it may be. That's a kind of aesthetic pleasure that Mill says we are capable of doing because we're not animals. And so that is an important way to distinguish what we mean by pleasures. It isn't just bodily pleasures. It's what he calls higher pleasures. Some kinds of pleasures are more desirable and more valuable than others. Intellectual, artistic, amicable, right? Friendships. All of those are above mere senses or mere bodily pleasures, and that's what Mill talks about when he focuses on the individual freedom that we have to express those. Let's not aim low, right? Because it's not that it's hard. It's not very hard to do. Why don't we just aim high, right? Aim for the intellect, the artistic, the aesthetic, because that's the kind of people we are. And the more educated we are, then the higher we can aim those pleasures. And we end up being just better people all around, because we're not sort of base creatures that are pleasured by the least thing. And he famously writes, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." So we do have sort of abilities to aim much higher. So that's the second one, the sort of a very limited notion of pleasure. And Mill says, no, we have a much wider and much grander view of pleasure. And the third criticism is that it's often quite difficult to decide exactly what a consequence is going to be as a result of our actions. There could be unintended consequences. Let's go back to the example I just kind of alluded to, where you may charge, possibly incarcerate, or even put to death someone because doing so will stop rioting in the streets. And as a result, that's what you're hoping for, because, okay, let's charge this person and we're going to incarcerate them. And even though we have no evidence against him, we're going to say he's the person that caused all this grief, and then people will go home and it'll be fine. No, instead, people get even more riled up. They realize what you've done, right? They found out that you've jailed an innocent person. Now all hell breaks loose. Those are unintended consequences. So we have to be very careful to identify exactly what the consequence is that you hope for through your actions. So you need to make sure that what that consequence is achievable, it's doable, it's plausible. And so we always need to keep in mind the possibility of things not going the way we planned or the way we expected, because unintended consequences do occur. And there's a short little link here if you want to take a look at that, what it means. And so even finally, the subjectivity of happiness, right? The individual views that people have of happiness. And there's a huge range of what makes people happy. Some people are happy with very little. Put a cat in a box and they just can play for hours. Put a little kid in a box, they'll play with that as well. But as we get older, we improve, become more intelligent, and we sort of aim a little higher. So the notion of happiness can change all through our lives. So happiness and pleasure and freedom and feeling good will change over time. So we need to be able to identify and articulate exactly what this subjective idea of happiness actually is. Is what I'm doing actually beneficial to me? So if we're aiming for consequences, right, the other question is, well, how do we calculate those consequences? How do we figure out what we're doing is for this particular reason? Can we actually calculate the cost versus the benefits, or the means versus the ends? So Bentham and Mill both argue that the greatest happiness principle is a standard of right and wrong, not necessarily a means of deciding. So the standard is this action will increase happiness, that action will decrease happiness. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But which one, let's say you have 5 different means to achieve the same ends. What do you do now? Well, if you're Mill, you would think of that rule, right? What is the rule by which I would say that under any other circumstances, this may not be a good thing, but it will give me what I'm looking for. It will give me the consequences that I'm aiming for. So Bentham and Mill do agree that there is a standard, which is increasing happiness, decreasing misery. but there's no way to really know exactly how to go about deciding it. We need to make sure that we can, well, if we're going to guess at it, that we do it well. We do it with some degree of intelligence, some degree of enlightenment, so that we know that whatever we're doing is still going to achieve some kind of consequence that we not only recognize, but we hope to achieve. So if we are doing this, we're thinking and we're being skeptical about our abilities to predict the outcome of a consequence. We would like to think that maybe we are doing the right thing because we've either basing it on previous track records. We've done this in the past and it seems to have worked. But no matter what, we always want to make sure that the outcome of our actions achieves a positive consequence. And of course, being skeptical that maybe not every single time is going to happen, but the majority of the time it can happen. So there have been a series of different changes in society, certainly over the last 5 to 10 years. A very quick case study would be harm reduction sites, or safe injection sites as they're called. And the idea here, policy planners believe that this was a good and beneficial thing because the notion was to minimize the negative health, social, and legal impacts of drug use. So you would end up with a safe injection site where people would go and would now be under controlled conditions so that if they overdosed, you would have someone there that could help them. And so even there, when we talk about an increase in social welfare and social happiness, even a harm reduction site has its opponents and its proponents. So proponents, those for it, say that, look, it reduces social harm to drug use. And yes, they have a safe place to go. There aren't needles left on the street. People are able to sit and be able to inject drugs using clean needles. They're not getting hepatitis C, B, and all the rest of it. And it's a safe thing. But opponents of this, even though it's a positive social policy, say that, look, any facilitation of drug use, any making easier, to shoot up is not a good thing. Because it's just enabling these people. It's not ending drug abuse. It's just prolonging it. It's making it more convenient. So keep in mind that these things will always happen. Whatever the policy is, the policy planners are thinking from a utilitarian point of view, but it's not something that's going to benefit everybody all the time. So we need to be able to keep that in mind. Okay, so that was utilitarianism. Now we're going to look at a couple of other isms. Romanticism and existentialism. And we'll briefly start with existentialism. And the two philosophers that are considered to be the originators of existentialism, although I would argue personally that it starts with the ancient Athenians and their ideas in tragic theater, the fact that we are in control of our lives, and there was tremendous fear over choice. The Athenians, as much as they were philosophizing about the world, were terrified of the fact that there was no accounting to the gods. Whatever you did was of your doing. And that's essentially what existentialism is. But I digress. Let's go back to what most people think to be original existentialists. These two, Søren Kierkegaard, this gentleman here, and Friedrich Nietzsche over on this side. Now, in the 20th century, existentialism has been associated primarily with French philosophy, or at least a branch of French philosophy. Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, these three writers and thinkers really looked deeply into the work of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, although I would say, given what I know of Sartre and Beauvoir, they put more in store with Nietzsche than they did with Kierkegaard. For example, Sartre believed that Kierkegaard, in a sense, sort of threw his lot in with God by saying, well, at the end of the day, if I'm really confused, I always have my leap of faith, right? That's my get out of jail free card. If I think myself into a corner and I'm just filled with existential doubt, I can turn around and say, well, but God still loves me. And Sartre said, look, that's a cop-out, right? Nietzsche at least said, look, God is dead and we're on our own, right? We've killed him. And Nietzsche's not saying that because he's proud. Quite the opposite. He's saying that because he said, look, we have been able to create a world in which we are the gods. And that's what he meant when he said God is dead and we have killed him. we have now become the people that we are in charge of ourselves. And therein lies this idea about existentialism as you are someone who is in charge of your own life. You call the shots, but you're responsible. So that's a heavy price to pay if you screw up. So that is sort of existentialism very briefly. We're going to now switch to Romanticism. We'll get back to existentialism in the later slides and then also in a couple of weeks. But I want to look at Romanticism here because it's also a response to all of these ideas that we've been looking at over the last couple of weeks. In particular, ideas associated with the Enlightenment, with early social formations, utilitarianism, as we just finished looking at. And it is a kind of counter movement, right? It goes against the grain of ideas presented in philosophy, in art, in theology. And the difference is, think about what we've talked about over the last few weeks. We've talked about the idea of reason versus sense data, rationalism versus empiricism. Romanticists or Romanticism, if it were a philosophy, would be on the side of empiricism because it is more concerned with emotion and states of being than it is with reason. It kind of runs away from reason, not because irrationality is good, but because reason is taking all the mystery out of life, right? The kind of transcendence that you can feel when you're walking through a forest and you feel that sense of just littleness. You are simply this little dot in this fantastic world called nature. That's Romanticism. And that's got nothing to do with reason. It's got everything to do with emotion, heightened states of emotion. And also too, that individuals have will. They have a free will. So we talked about that last week and this week a little bit when we talk about morality, that we have a free will, but that free will is passionate, it is unique, it can be enamored over any range of natural events or even people. So it's not based on rationality. It's based on emotional states. And so in terms of the course we're taking, Searching for Reality, what Romanticism does is it gives us this radically new way of looking at the world, connecting with the world on a deep, deep level. It isn't just in terms of using reason, it's using sense data, emotion, these heightened states of being. And it is also a reaction to some of the industrial developments, economic and social developments, this enlightened focus on reason, and just all the social norms that have been occurring during this period of time, where in social norms there is a norm is called a prescriptive behavior. In other words, an expected form of behavior. Again, the mystery is taken out of life. Everyone expects to act a certain way. There's no excitement in the world anymore. There's no people sort of lighting up for the territory to live somewhere else away from people. And of course, this is exactly what the Romantics did, right? They just took off and they lived in ancient ruins. They loved to live and seep themselves in history because this was a period of time that was almost before reason, before all these social norms, before the revolution, the industrial revolution in particular. So Romanticism has this deep, deep connection with nature, with previous ideas about nature in terms of mythology, about history as powerful figures that can change the course of history. It's really about the individual. It's about the individual almost kind of for the first time. Because when you think about a lot of the ideas that we've been looking at all the way along, certainly over the last 1,000 years, whether they're theological or whether they're rational, they're really more concerned with ideas, right? And objective, impartial ideas. And along comes Romanticism, and they almost embrace irrationality only because it is not rationality. It is not reason. So Romantics positioned themselves against the rationality of the Enlightenment and turned away from industrialization, turned away from society, and moved towards nature and emotion and mythology, mythological viewpoints of the world, the ancient ideas about the sun, right? Ancient ideas about forests and things that we were beginning to forget about as we were becoming more reasonable. And Romantics, if they did anything to cause us to rethink, they were also, even at this early point, and this is now sort of the 1700s, seeing now not reason, but the beginning of rationality. And it's really that they're more afraid of. Reason is one thing. You can be reasonable, but rationality sometimes just flattens everything out. Everything has a kind of sameness to it. And so sameness is important in an industrial world. Oh, every morning from 9 to 5, you're going to be in the same place, Monday to Friday, and you need this much sleep, and you have got to go to this place. Oh, God forbid, now you've got bills. Oh, I've got to pay this much money every week, every month. I've got to pay my rent, my mortgage. All these things that tie people down to a particular way of life. Romantics threw that away. They rejected that. And so the rationality of day-to-day life and the mystery that's gone out of everyday life, that's what the Romantics were trying to find again. So they approached the universe, they approached reality through a kind of almost symbolic relationship. And it sounds a bit odd, but what they mean is they start considering what things represent. The beauty of a sunset, the beauty of a mountainside, the beauty of a human face. All these things become symbolic. And not only that, but they all sort of tap into what at that time was called a collective unconscious. This notion that each of us shared these unconscious ideas, that we would be receptive to these unconscious notions about, symbolic views of the sun, symbolic views of the ocean, symbolic views of whatever it is you happen to be talking about. But there is this very sublime relationship with nature. And that in itself is not a bad thing. What is happening, though, is a reevaluating of the degree to which rationality was turning a beautiful, awe-inspiring, almost, that's almost the terror of a forest. Because if you've ever been lost in a forest, you know exactly what I mean. But there's sometimes that sublime feeling we have of something like a forest, and along comes a capitalist and says, nice picnic table. Yeah, I can build a couple thousand hockey sticks with those trees. That's rationality. And Romantics hated that. You've just destroyed the sublime beauty of this forest by transforming it into products. That's what they were doing. Romantics hated that. So there is a historical connection with viewing the world through this set of eyes, through mythology and symbols. Sounds a little bit like the ancients, right? The ancient Greeks, who really filtered their response to nature through mythology, right? They had a series of stories about events, natural events, and why they occurred, would associate them with gods. What the Romantics did is they dispensed with the gods, but they kept the stories, right? Because the stories were often beautiful and fascinating and mysterious. Because just because you look in the forest, we shouldn't fear the fact that we can't grasp its mystery. Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes things are mysterious. And Romantics want us to keep that. So reality in this case, it's equal parts mythology and it's equal parts actual nature. So a very remarkable way of looking at the world. And certainly if we're talking about searching for reality, these folks were doing exactly that. They were trying to find a new version of reality, one in which the mystery was not washed away or rationalized to the degree where a beautiful, awe-inspiring tree is simply, a hockey stick. That's not the way the Romantics viewed the world. So if they searched for reality in any way, they were searching for that mystery, searching for that sublime moment of looking at a mountainside and just being filled with awe. Now, this was a response to rationality in industrialization. It was also a reaction to people like Kant, to the idealists, those individuals who are focusing everything on reason. And so the world of appearances versus the world as it really is was something that was really important to the Romantics. The first sort of reaction is that we construct a world and we emphasize individual freedom in interpreting reality. And so here we are, Romantics saying, look, I want that freedom. I want to be able to live in a certain place. And I want to maintain that sense of awe because I want to feel connected with nature and be, one with the universe and all these kinds of things. So that's the first kind of reaction towards Kant. There may be a world of appearances versus the world as it really is, but I don't want to give that up. If the world of appearances is what's there and the world is a phenomena that is given to me and I organize it in my brain, let me organize it the way I wish. So that's the first sort of reaction against Kant. The second one is this idea of that the world really is. We can't just know the world through reason. It's limiting. So the Romantics said, no, this is a very myopic, limiting view of the world. It's looking at the world through a little tiny eye hole, and instead open up, look, use both eyes, right? Relate to the world spiritually, mystically, emotionally. Those two are roads to knowledge, right? Those two are the means to an end. And if the end is that moment of sublime beauty, then so be it. So Romantics, of course, these very unique visions of the world, filtered the interaction with reality through symbols, through mythology. They also filtered it through play and creativity. There were many Romantic poets, William Blake being probably one of the most famous ones, very many Romantic writers and painters. And really what these individuals were trying to do, two things. One, to get in touch with the inexhaustible, right? The mystical, the awe-inspiring, the inexpressible, and then try to turn around and create it. So that's a tall order. So on the one hand, tap into these moments, these heightened states of being that are well past reason. And then once you connect with that, to try to express it in whichever way you can, whatever medium you are best equipped to write in or paint in or music or whatever. All these things are trying to do the same thing, right? To identify the inexpressible element in nature, in reality. And then once you've identified it, to try to the best of your abilities to describe it in words, in music, in painting. And so the Romantic movement really was this kind of twofold relationship. So there's definitely a deliberate attempt to escape, the bounds of reason, the very stifling view of seeing the world only through one sort of one little telescope. In fact, go panorama, go stereo, go quadraphonic, and look at it from all of the different ways that you can see the world, right? Experience it from all these different levels, the mystical, the spiritual, the emotional. All of these things make for a greater interplay with the world around you. So Romantics, of course, are slightly different. The British version versus the French version versus the German. The German version also just as important and interesting. Some Romantics were not so afraid of Kant, we'll say. They tried, once again, as philosophers tend to do, they try to unify, right, what has come before. And Schelling and Herder are two German philosophers that pretty well lived around the same time in the early 1800s. In art, we find the unity of ego and nature, right? That reason has, in a sense, kind of pulled apart. And so Schelling believes that the ego and nature coexist. Now, that should sound kind of familiar. And I'm going to give you a hint. It's Spinoza, right? Spinoza talking about that utterly unique interpenetration of nature, ego, God. Because remember, God is in nature and nature is in God. It's not pantheistic, it's panentheistic, right? All of this put into something else. So what some of these German Romantics were thinking was that Kant and his use of reason had been a tool that had torn that relationship apart. And what Schelling and Herder, even others like Hegel, they said, look, we need to reconcile these two. We need to reunify ego and nature because reason has torn it apart. We're now we're on the outside looking in to something that is actually part of us. So yeah, that is actually much closer to Spinoza than it is to Kant, this kind of monadic view, right? That singular view. And who else does that sound like? That's Parmenides, right? Parmenides talking about us living in this bubble where we have equal sense of justice, equal movements to the exterior that is all even, and we are living in the one. So if romantics do anything, they look back to the 1600s to ideas presented by Spinoza. There's also Leibniz, monadology, but let's not worry about that. The notion of a oneness, that's really what's important in the romantic view of the world. The view presented by Schelling, who was, although still a German idealist, like Hegel, was trying to reunify, or perhaps even unify for the first time, the ego and nature together. And so what happens is we now are connected in a much deeper way with the world around us. And maybe we stop searching for reality, or at least find it temporarily until rationality takes over. But that's Schelling. So Herder, on the other hand, says, okay, to see a tree, right, requires a kind of experience that we are not going to find in rationality. So if we remove reason and we leave ourselves open to the moment, right, that pure existence, that mystical, emotional, spiritual, all those different dimensions that go beyond reason, that's how we should see the world, right? Completely open. Sounds kind of exhausting, but it would be kind of fascinating too. And that's why he says, right, to see a tree requires verse and experience, and we need to be able to look at something not from a reasonable or ahistorical or objective view, but quite the opposite, from an emotional, subjective, historical, me here and now in this moment experiencing this. Now, even though that's romantic, the existentialists really do buy into this view of the world, because there's a lot of similarity between these two ways of thinking about the world. And there you go, existentialism and romanticism. So although Kierkegaard may have been ambivalent towards romanticism, he was still very much influenced by that particular way of thinking. And so his only complaint, though, was that romantics were perhaps more preoccupied with aesthetics. And this is, trying to define the indefinable, express the inexpressible. Kierkegaard believed that the romantics were more concerned with doing that than they were with actually experience, right? The being in the moment, right? Truly in the moment on all these different levels in their interaction with reality. So that's one of the criticisms that Kierkegaard had. And so he said, look, without, of course, because he was still a believer, so that religious dimension was important. He said, look, without that, you're really sort of not taking in the totality of that potential relationship you have with the outside world. So scientific rationality, Kierkegaard was not fond of. It's too sterile, too objective, too experimental based, not experience based. And of course, economics considered even worse, because it simply looks at the world as fodder, right? Just looks as something to just throw up on that slaughter bench and to get rid of it. So in that sense, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are very similar, because they wanted to deal with the personal, the subjective, the emotional. And it's there that those two individuals thought that there was more at stake. There are better ideas there than simply looking at the world from this point of view of simply reason and rationality. So if we want to try to look at it in these two, now existentialism more so, it is a mode of being. It's a way of being. It's a way to be in the moment rather than a particular doctrine, because to explain existentialism it's not impossible, but it has a lot to do with simply just being, right? If you ever read Heidegger with a capital B, being, like that's being in its pure essence. And then we have small b, being, which is us interacting with something. In this case, there's a kind of a small b. So existentialism is a mode of being. It's a way of being open, responsive, open to these other experiences that are their, parapsychological or metaphysical, spiritual, aesthetic, all these things, rather than just seeing what's going on. Luckily, we're not robots yet. We're not cameras, right? We are not cameras. Our eyes are connected to our brain, our ears to our brain, our hearts are in between all of that. So we can respond emotionally to something that we see or hear, and that's still a good thing. That's still a road to knowledge. And that's what both the Romantics and the Existentialists wished for us to consider, right? To see things existentially is to relate things to us as subjective individuals, not impartial, not scientific, not rational, homo economicus kind of things. No, as living, breathing beings in that moment. And that's how we should relate to things all the time. So we shouldn't make the mistake of confusing our inner lives with who we are, because existentialists believe that even if we're faking it, that's who we are. So be careful, right? Because if you act a certain way, like you act with others, they think you believe in certain things or you do certain things in a certain way, be careful, because that's who others will think you are. And eventually you're going to start playing that role. So existentialists, much like Romantics, said live authentically. Live really, if you can, if that's even a word, but live authentically. So this becomes very important to existentialists, because Sartre famously said, existence precedes essence. Our existence in the world, our being in the world, and our being in the world for others as well as for ourselves, that precedes anything that has to do with essence, which is, what is the gist of Ed Matthews? What is the gist of X and Y, right? The essence of this person is the following. How is that defined? By your existence, by the way you behave, by your mode of being. So all of these things have a lot to do with the way we interact with ourselves, our inner and outer selves, with each other, and especially with the surrounding reality. So if we're searching for reality, we're going to leave this course still trying to, let's do it that way. Let's do it in a more open fashion, open to that spiritual, aesthetic, emotional state that accompanies the world, right? That accompanies everything that we respond to. Let's not cut that off, right? Let's make that part of who we are. So that is the lesson for this week on 3 different isms: utilitarianism, romanticism, and existentialism. That's my little granddaughter wandering around. I don't know if you heard her. So that's essentially what is going on here. Different modes of being in the world. Yes, I know. And so we're going to wrap up here before things get too crazy. But we'll meet again on Monday afternoon. We can talk about this in more detail, and we will revisit existentialism when we talk about Simone de Beauvoir and her particular view of feminism. But we will return to that. But for today, utilitarianism, its relationship to Kant and deontology and the categorical imperative, and as well as romanticism, that is a response against the increased rationality in social norms. Romanticism closer to Spinoza because of that deep connection between ego and nature, or ego, self, and nature. And finally, existentialism, which is an even a further deepening of a romantic viewpoint, saying that we are responsible for who we are. We are responsible for our behavior, and whatever behavior we choose to follow through with, we have no one else to blame but ourselves, because we cannot have freedom but abdicate responsibility. It's one with the other. Okay, so quick little recap. We'll see each other in a couple of days. Have a good weekend. It's Saturday afternoon, almost 4 o'clock. So I'm done for now. I'll see you in a couple of days.